183 BC, Liternum. This is not the end a hero deserves. There is no marble, no triumphant arch, only the relentless, indifferent whisper of the Tyrrhenian Sea and the salty wind that seems to carry the damp chill of the grave right into the bones of the villa. The air, thick with the smell of brine and coastal scrub, is a world away from the sharp, intoxicating scent of laurel wreaths and burning incense that once filled the capital in his honor. This is the place of exile, a quiet, gray purgatory for the man who painted the Mediterranean Roman red with the blood of its enemies. He sits, a ghost in his own life, the conqueror of Hannibal, the man they called Africanus, now just Publius Cornelius Scipio, a citizen disowned. The sounds that reach him are not the roar of 10,000 legionaries chanting his name, but the lonely cry of gulls and the rustle of brittle olive leaves. When he looks at his hands, he does not see the hands that held the fate of civilizations, but the knotted, trembling flesh of a dying man, a man consumed not by age, but by a cold, simmering rage that has been his only companion in this final act. The pain of old wounds from the battlefields of Spain and Africa is a dull ache, a familiar friend compared to the fresh, sharp agony of betrayal that twists in his gut. He sees the faces of his accusers in the shimmering heat above the sand. He hears the venomous oratory of Cato in the hiss of the waves. The man who, with the patience of dripping water, eroded the mountain of his legacy. This was the saga of how the savior of Rome was forced to die in exile, forgotten and bitter. And to understand this colossal tragedy, one must understand the crushing irony. At the very moment of his solitary death, the republic he saved, the ungrateful child he nurtured with his own blood and genius, was continuing its inexorable march towards empire, a behemoth built upon the foundations he laid, yet a creature that could no longer tolerate the shadow of its own creator. To fathom how a man who stood at the absolute zenith of glory could be hurled into such a desolate abyss, we must first return to the world that made him, a world of terror and desperation, a world that desperately needed a hero it would later come to despise. This is the narrative of him, Publius Cornelius Scipio, a name that would become both a symbol of Rome's ultimate triumph and its most profound shame. This was the man who looked into the abyss when the abyss was named Hannibal Barca, and did not blink. He inherited a republic on the verge of utter collapse, a state psychologically shattered, its legions annihilated, its allies defecting, its very heartland occupied by a seemingly invincible enemy for more than a decade. He was the surgeon who performed a desperate, life-or-death operation on the body politic, and, against all odds, succeeded. The central, agonizing paradox of his life, the question that echoes through the marble corridors of history, is this: how did the man who achieved what no other Roman could, the man who single-handedly exorcised the demon of Hannibal from Italy, end his life not with a state funeral in the Forum, but with a self-imposed exile, allegedly commanding that his tomb bear the inscription, "Ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones"? What dark alchemy of politics, what venomous envy, what fatal flaw in the character of the man or the state he served could transmute absolute victory into such personal desolation? This is not merely a story of battles and strategies. It is a deep psychological drama about the unbearable weight of greatness. It is the saga of a man who possessed a vision and a talent so immense that it warped the very fabric of the republic he fought to preserve. The Roman system, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, was a finely tuned machine designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. Scipio, through his victories, his charisma, and his sheer force of will did not just challenge this system, his very existence became a threat to it. He became a living paradox, the indispensable man in a society that could not tolerate indispensability. His story forces us to confront the terrifying question of whether a state, in order to save its soul, must sometimes devour its greatest heroes. Thus, the journey to understand Scipio's exile is a journey into the heart of Rome itself, into its deepest fears and its most cherished ideals, a collision of heroic individualism and collective security that would ultimately break the hero and set Rome on a new and perhaps darker path. To understand this man, we must first return to the world of his youth, a world teetering on the precipice of annihilation. The middle of the 3rd century BC was not a time of Roman confidence. It was an age of existential dread. The Mediterranean was a chessboard, and the two great players were the sprawling, mercantile empire of Carthage and the tenacious, land-based Republic of Rome. The First Punic War had ended in a Roman victory, but it was a bitter, exhausting affair that settled nothing, merely sowing the seeds for a far more terrible conflict. The air itself was thick with the promise of renewed war, and from the heart of Carthaginian territory in Spain, a storm was gathering. This storm had a name: Hannibal Barca. He was not merely a general, he was an idea, a force of nature, the living embodiment of a sacred oath, sworn as a child to forever be an enemy of Rome. When he crossed the Alps in 218 BC with his war elephants and his battle-hardened army, he did not just invade Italy, he plunged a dagger into the heart of the Republic. The Roman response, initially arrogant and dismissive, was brutally crushed. The Battle of the Trebia, the Battle of Lake Trasimene, each was a catastrophe, a lesson written in the blood of tens of thousands of legionaries. But it was Cannae in 216 BC that transcended disaster and became a foundational trauma etched into the Roman soul. It was a battle of annihilation, a tactical masterpiece by Hannibal that resulted in the death or capture of perhaps 70,000 Roman soldiers on a single horrific afternoon. The scale of the loss was unimaginable. It is said that every single family in Rome lost someone. The city was stripped of its defenders, plunged into a state of mass panic and religious hysteria. The shadow of Hannibal loomed over the city walls, a boogeyman to frighten children with for generations to come. This was the world that forged Scipio, a world where the gods seemed to have abandoned Rome, where the Senate was paralyzed by fear and indecision, and where the military machine that had conquered Italy was broken and bleeding. It was a landscape of pure desperation, a crucible that would either consume the Republic entirely or forge a new kind of leader, one who could think like the enemy and rise above the rigid traditions that had led Rome to the brink of extinction. Into this world of fire and fear was born Publius Cornelius Scipio, a son of the gens Cornelia, one of Rome's most ancient and distinguished patrician families. To be a Cornelius was to be born with the weight of history on your shoulders. It was to be expected to lead armies, govern provinces, and add to the family's already immense prestige. But his inheritance was not just one of glory, it was also a curse of blood and failure. His father, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, and his uncle, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, were the commanders tasked with containing Carthaginian power in Spain. For years they fought with distinction, tying down crucial enemy forces that might otherwise have reinforced Hannibal in Italy. But in 211 BC, disaster struck. In a series of brilliantly executed maneuvers, the Carthaginian generals, including Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, isolated and destroyed both Roman armies. Both Scipio's father and uncle were killed in battle, their heads allegedly paraded on pikes. News of this catastrophe sent fresh waves of terror through Rome, as Spain was now completely lost, its resources at Carthage's disposal, and the gateway to Italy through Gaul lay wide open. For the young Scipio, then in his early 20s, this was not a distant geopolitical event. It was a deeply personal trauma. He had lost his father and his uncle, the pillars of his world, to the very enemy that was strangling his homeland. This loss, this public humiliation of his family name, became the furnace in which his character was forged. The grief did not break him. It tempered him, transforming youthful ambition into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He understood, in a way that the older, more cautious senators could not, that the traditional Roman way of war was failing. He saw that to defeat a genius like Hannibal, one needed more than just courage and discipline. One needed cunning, audacity, and a willingness to break the rules. The blood of his kin spilled on the dusty plains of Iberia was the price of his education. It extinguished the boy and gave birth to the commander, a man driven not only by patriotic duty, but by a burning, all-consuming need for vengeance, a need to restore the honor of the Cornelii and to personally destroy the empire that had taken everything from him. The first glimpse of this extraordinary destiny, the first spark of the legend to come, appeared on the misty banks of the Ticinus River in northern Italy in the year 218 BC. Scipio was just a teenager, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, serving his first campaign under his father, the presiding consul. The Roman army, confident and eager to punish the audacious Carthaginian who had dared to cross the Alps, met Hannibal's forces in a chaotic cavalry skirmish. It was a disaster. The Romans, caught off guard by the superior Numidian cavalry, were quickly outflanked and overwhelmed. Scipio's father, leading from the front as was expected of a Roman consul, was wounded and surrounded, about to be cut down by the enemy. From a distance, the young Scipio saw his father's plight. According to the historian Polybius, while the rest of the Roman cavalry wavered or fled, the boy was initially frozen with fear. But then, something ignited within him. In a moment that would define his life, he spurred his horse on, calling for others to follow, and charged headlong into the fray. This act of raw, almost suicidal courage broke the spell of fear. A small group of cavalrymen rallied to him, and together they smashed their way through the enemy ranks, managing to rescue the wounded consul and drag him back to the safety of the main Roman line. This was more than just an act of filial piety. It was a revelation. In an army that valued discipline and collective action above all, this was a display of stunning individual initiative. It was a sign that this young man possessed not only the courage expected of a Cornelius, but something more, an innate sense of the decisive moment, an ability to inspire others in the face of terror, and a willingness to risk everything for a single, crucial objective. The story of his heroism spread through the camp, a small flicker of light in the growing darkness of the Italian campaign. It was the first time his name was spoken with awe, the first taste of the intoxicating bond between a commander and the soldiers who witness his greatness firsthand. The battle itself was a defeat, but for Scipio, it was a profound personal victory. The moment he stepped out from his father's shadow and onto the blood-soaked stage of history, having proven to himself and the world that he was not afraid to ride into hell to save what he loved. What truly set Scipio apart from the stolid, tradition-bound senators of his generation was not just his military talent, but the profound and almost mystical source of his self-belief. This was not the simple patriotism of a Roman aristocrat. It was a deeply personal, almost messianic conviction in his own destiny, in his own fortuna. Ancient sources, particularly those hostile to him, often whispered of his strange habits. It was said that he was a man of intense, almost theatrical piety. Before undertaking any significant action, whether in politics or in war, he would go to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. He would arrive before dawn, dismiss his attendants, and enter the sanctuary's inner sanctum, the cella, alone. There, he would remain for hours in silent communion, as if receiving direct counsel from the king of the gods himself. When he emerged, his face would be serene, imbued with a quiet confidence that seemed almost otherworldly. This practice had a dual effect. On one hand, it filled his soldiers with a powerful sense of awe and belief. They saw a commander who did not merely ask for the gods' favor, but who communed with them directly. They came to believe that Scipio was touched by the divine, that victory followed him as a matter of fate. This cultivated an intense personal loyalty that transcended allegiance to the Senate and people of Rome. On the other hand, it deeply unsettled the political establishment in Rome. Men like Cato saw this not as piety, but as a dangerous and profoundly un-Roman form of charismatic leadership, more akin to the Hellenistic kings of the East who claimed divine status. They saw it as a form of hubris, an attempt to place himself above the Republic and its institutions. But for Scipio, this was his inner demon, his secret motivation. He was driven by a need to avenge his father and uncle, but this quest for vengeance was fused with the unshakable belief that he was the chosen instrument of the gods, destined to save Rome. This conviction gave him the audacity to defy conventions, to propose radical strategies, and to demand powers that no one his age had ever wielded. It was the source of his genius and the seed of his eventual downfall. He believed he was special, that he operated on a higher plane and in a republic built on the ideal of equality among the elite. Being special was the most dangerous quality a man could possess. The fateful encounter that would launch Scipio's monumental career was not with a single person, but with the collective desperation of the Roman Senate in the dark days of 210 BC. The situation was catastrophic. Following the deaths of Scipio's father and uncle, Roman power in Spain had completely disintegrated. Carthage was now free to exploit the peninsula's vast silver mines and recruit its fierce Celtiberian warriors. The Senate knew it had to send a new army and a new commander, but the question was who? The Spanish command was seen as a death sentence. The most experienced generals were either dead or bogged down fighting Hannibal in Italy. No one wanted the job. An assembly was called to elect a new proconsul, but no candidates of sufficient stature stepped forward. The forum fell into a grim, anxious silence. The future of the Republic hung in the balance, and its leaders were paralyzed by fear. It was into this vacuum of leadership that the 25-year-old Publius Cornelius Scipio strode. He ascended the rostra, the speaker's platform, and in a moment of pure political theater, declared that he would take the command if the Roman people would have him. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. He held no rank higher than a dial. He was far too young and inexperienced to be entrusted with an independent proconsular army. Yet, the crowd, weary of the cautious, failing leadership of the old guard, responded with a roar of approval. They saw in him the youth, the confidence, and the divine favor that Rome so desperately needed. They saw the hero of the Ticinus, the scion of a martyred family burning for revenge. The assembly voted for him unanimously, effectively forcing the Senate's hand. This was a revolutionary moment. The Roman people, in an expression of popular will that bypassed all tradition and precedent, had chosen their champion. The encounter was thus a gamble on all sides. For the Senate, it was a reluctant concession, a way to fill a cursed command with an ambitious and perhaps disposable young aristocrat. For the people, it was an act of faith, a desperate prayer for a miracle. And for Scipio, it was the chance he had been waiting for, the moment his personal ambition, his thirst for vengeance, and his belief in his own destiny converged with the existential needs of the state. He was given an army of survivors and cast-offs, a broken command in a lost province, and an impossible mission. It was a command born of despair, but for a man with nothing left to lose, it was the perfect stage on which to build a legend. Upon arriving in Spain, Scipio immediately demonstrated that he was a new kind of Roman commander, one who understood that the most important battlefield was the mind. His army was demoralized, a collection of shattered legions who had witnessed the deaths of his father and uncle and believed the war was lost. His enemies, 3 separate Carthaginian armies, were confident and controlled nearly the entire peninsula. A conventional general would have spent months cautiously rebuilding his forces and engaging in minor skirmishes. Scipio knew he did not have time for caution. He needed a victory that was not just military, but psychological. An act so bold it would shatter the enemy's confidence and ignite a fire in the hearts of his own men. His target was the heart of Carthaginian power in Spain, the city of Carthago Nova, or New Carthage. It was a major port, a naval base, and the treasury where the Carthaginians kept their military war chest and the hostages taken from local Spanish tribes. The city was considered impregnable, protected by massive walls and a narrow isthmus, with its rear guarded by a large, shallow lagoon. Scipio learned from local fishermen that the lagoon was tidal and could be waded at certain times. This was the secret he needed. In a lightning-fast march, he brought his army before the city, taking the Carthaginian commanders completely by surprise. He launched a diversionary assault on the main gates, drawing all the defenders to the walls. Then, as the tide went out, he sent 500 chosen men across the exposed lagoon. They scaled the unguarded rear wall, sowing panic and chaos within the city. The main gates were opened from the inside, and the city fell in a single afternoon. The price of this power was not just in the spoils of war, the vast quantities of gold and silver seized, but in the masterful display of clemency that followed. Instead of sacking the city and enslaving its population, as was Roman custom, Scipio treated the inhabitants with magnanimity. He freed the Spanish hostages, returning them to their tribes with honor. This single act of calculated mercy did more to win over Spain than a dozen bloody victories. It sent a message across the peninsula. Rome, under Scipio, was not just a conqueror, but a potential liberator. He had not only captured the enemy's strategic center, he had stolen their moral authority and their network of alliances. The capture of New Carthage was a thunderclap, a statement of intent from a commander who waged war with intellect and audacity as much as with iron and steel. The great antagonist of this epic, the shadow that loomed over Scipio's entire life and career, was, of course, Hannibal Barca. To see Hannibal as merely a skilled general is to fundamentally misunderstand his significance. For Rome, he was a force of cosmic terror, an existential threat on a scale they had never before encountered. He was the product of a different world, the sophisticated, seafaring, mercantile empire of Carthage, a civilization whose values were often diametrically opposed to the agrarian, militaristic ethos of Rome. Hannibal's genius was multifaceted. He was a master strategist, capable of conceiving and executing continent-spanning campaigns like his legendary march over the Alps. He was a peerless battlefield tactician, as demonstrated at Cannae, where he used a deliberately weak center to envelop and annihilate a numerically superior Roman force, a maneuver still studied in military academies to this day. But above all, he was a master of psychology. He understood his own men, a diverse mercenary army of Africans, Spaniards, and Gauls, and knew how to mold their disparate loyalties into an unbreakable bond with him personally. More importantly, he understood his enemy. He knew how to exploit Roman arrogance, their rigid command structures, and their predictable, head-on tactics. For over 15 years, he remained in Italy, a hostile presence that the combined might of Rome could not dislodge. He was like a poison in the Republic's bloodstream, slowly draining its manpower, wrecking its economy, and fostering rebellion among its Italian allies. He became a figure of myth, his name invoked to scare children. The phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal at the gates, became a Roman expression for imminent disaster. For Scipio, Hannibal was more than the man responsible for his father's and uncle's deaths. He was the ultimate benchmark, the final boss. Scipio's entire military education in Spain was, in essence, a preparation for a single, inevitable confrontation with this man. He studied Hannibal's methods, adopted his flexible tactics, learned his use of cavalry and reconnaissance, all in service of one day facing the master himself. Hannibal represented the macro-level threat, the embodiment of a rival civilization's will to power, and defeating him was not just a matter of military victory. It was a psychological necessity for the survival of the Roman world. The fatal mistake that defined the entire Second Punic War was not Scipio's, but that of the generation of commanders who preceded him. It occurred on a hot, dusty plain in southern Italy in the year 216 BC, near a small village named Cannae. It was here that the Roman Republic's traditional approach to warfare, its reliance on the sheer mass and discipline of its heavy infantry, its faith in aggressive, head-on assaults, and the hubris of its annually elected consuls, collided with the fluid, adaptable genius of Hannibal and was utterly annihilated. The consuls, Varro and Paulus, commanding a force of perhaps 80,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever put into the field, sought a decisive, war-ending battle. Hannibal, with a smaller, more diverse army, gave it to them. He allowed his center, composed of weaker Gallic and Spanish infantry, to deliberately buckle and retreat, drawing the massive Roman legions forward into a trap. As the Romans surged into the sagging center, Hannibal's elite African infantry, positioned on the wings, wheeled inwards, while his superior Carthaginian cavalry, having already routed their Roman counterparts, swept around to attack the legions from behind. The Roman army was completely encircled. What followed was not a battle, but an industrial-scale slaughter that lasted for hours under the blazing sun. The legionaries, packed so tightly they could barely lift their arms to fight, were systematically cut down. This was the blackest day in Roman history, a national trauma that left an indelible scar on the collective psyche of the Republic. For Scipio, then a young military tribune who survived the carnage and helped rally the few thousand survivors at Canusium, this was the ultimate lesson. He understood in that moment of supreme horror that courage and numbers were not enough. He saw that the old Roman way was a blunt instrument, utterly ineffective against a mind like Hannibal's. Cannae taught him the value of flexibility, of combined arms, of knowing when to retreat, and of using terrain and deception as weapons. But the catastrophe had a deeper, more insidious psychological consequence for Rome. The sheer terror of Cannae created a deep-seated fear of decisive battles, and more importantly, a profound suspicion of any commander who seemed too brilliant, too successful, or too popular. It was a fear that would eventually turn on Scipio himself. The ghost of Cannae would haunt the Senate for decades, a constant reminder that the greatest threat to the Republic could come not just from its enemies, but from one of its own sons who became too powerful. The chaos and devastation of the war, particularly in the seemingly lost cause of Spain, became the very crucible in which Scipio could forge his new vision for the Roman military. Back in Italy, the war had devolved into a grim strategy of attrition, led by the cautious Quintus Fabius Maximus, the cunctator or delayer. Fabius's strategy was to shadow Hannibal, harass his supply lines, and avoid a pitched battle at all costs, a sensible but deeply un-Roman approach that grated on the national pride. This Fabian strategy, while necessary, was stagnant. Spain, however, was different. It was a sideshow, a strategic backwater in the eyes of many senators. The defeat and death of Scipio's father and uncle had written it off as a lost cause. This very neglect gave Scipio a freedom that no commander in Italy possessed. He was thousands of miles from the cautious oversight of the Senate, leading an army of forgotten survivors who had nothing to lose and were willing to embrace radical new ideas. Spain became Scipio's personal laboratory. Here, he could experiment. He meticulously studied Hannibal's tactics, deconstructing the victory at Cannae not as a source of shame, but as a textbook to be learned from. He saw that Hannibal's strength lay in his superior cavalry, particularly the swift Numidians, and in his flexible infantry formations. So, Scipio set about creating his own version. He recruited and trained Spanish horsemen, creating a cavalry arm that could challenge Carthage's best. He abandoned the rigid, monolithic Roman maniple formation, retraining his legionaries to fight in smaller, more adaptable cohorts, capable of executing complex battlefield maneuvers similar to those used by Hannibal's veterans. He emphasized reconnaissance, deception, and combined arms, teaching his infantry, cavalry, and skirmishers to work together as a seamless whole. He was not just a commander, he was an innovator, a revolutionary who was building a new model army from the ground up. He used the chaos of the Spanish theater, the freedom from political interference, and the desperation of his situation to create a force that was Roman in its discipline and resilience, but Carthaginian in its tactical sophistication. This new army, forged in the fires of a forgotten war, would become the instrument of his vengeance and Rome's salvation, a weapon perfectly designed to one day defeat the master himself. The culmination of Scipio's Spanish laboratory, the battle that proved his methods and established him as a tactical genius on par with Hannibal, took place in 206 BC near a town called Ilipa. This was his masterpiece, the Spanish Zama. Scipio found himself facing a massive new Carthaginian army, reinforced from Africa and determined to crush him once and for all. He was outnumbered. A conventional Roman commander would have placed his best troops, the veteran Roman legions, in the center of his battle line, with his less reliable Spanish allies on the flanks. The Carthaginian general, Hasdrubal Gisco, anticipated exactly this. For several days, the two armies drew up and faced each other without engaging, each commander observing the other's dispositions. Every day, Scipio deployed his army in the same formation. Romans in the center, Spanish on the wings. Hasdrubal mirrored him, placing his best African troops in his center to counter the legions. It was a stalemate, but this was all part of Scipio's plan, a brilliant piece of psychological conditioning. On the day of the battle, he ordered his men to eat and arm themselves before dawn. Then, at first light, he marched his army out in a shocking reversal of his previous deployments. He placed his Spanish allies in the center and his highly trained Roman legions on the wings. He advanced at high speed, catching the Carthaginians completely off guard, forcing them to form up without having had their morning meal. He then executed a complex and daring maneuver. While his weak Spanish center advanced slowly, his Roman legions on the wings, operating in their flexible cohort formations, wheeled outwards and then inwards, rapidly encircling and smashing the weaker troops on the Carthaginian flanks. Hasdrubal's elite African infantry in the center, pinned in place by Scipio's slowly advancing Spanish allies, could do nothing but watch as their army's wings were annihilated. The Carthaginian army collapsed and was systematically destroyed during a desperate retreat. Ilipa was a Cannae in reverse, using Hannibal's own principles of envelopment against a Carthaginian army. It was a stunning intellectual and military triumph that permanently shattered Carthaginian power in Spain. The victory secured the entire peninsula for Rome, and, more importantly, confirmed that Scipio had not only learned from the master, but was now ready to surpass him. The return to Rome after the triumph at Ilipa was the moment Scipio ascended from a promising general to a living legend. He was only 29 years old. He had avenged his father and uncle, conquered a vast and wealthy territory, and done it all with an army of cast-offs. The city, starved for good news and desperate for a hero, erupted in celebration. He was elected consul for the following year, 205 BC, by a unanimous and overwhelming popular vote. The roar of the crowd in the Campus Martius was intoxicating, a validation of his risks, his innovations, and his unshakable self-belief. It was at this moment of supreme triumph, however, that the psychology of the man began to shift, and the first hints of a dangerous hubris appeared. He was no longer just a general of the Republic. He saw himself as its destined savior. He now proposed a plan so audacious, so contrary to the cautious Fabian strategy that had dominated Roman thinking for a decade, that it horrified the old guard of the Senate. He wanted to take the war directly to Africa. His logic was simple. The only way to get Hannibal out of Italy was to threaten Carthage itself. But to men like Quintus Fabius Maximus, this was madness. They saw it as a reckless gamble that would leave Italy undefended. Fabius, in a series of powerful speeches in the Senate, attacked Scipio, not just on strategic grounds, but on personal ones. He painted him as a rash, glory-seeking youth, a man whose ambition was a danger to the state. This was the first major political battle of Scipio's career, and it revealed the deep chasm between his vision and the traditional Roman ethos. He saw himself as cutting the Gordian knot, while they saw him as recklessly endangering the Republic for personal glory. Although the Senate, swayed by his immense popularity, grudgingly allowed him to proceed, they denied him a new army, granting him only the command of the 2 legions disgraced at Cannae, who were stationed in Sicily, and permission to recruit volunteers. It was a political compromise intended to hamstring him, but for Scipio, it was a challenge. The moment of triumph was also the moment he realized that his greatest enemies were not just in Carthage, but in the very Senate chamber he sought to serve. The hubris was not in his plan, but in his growing belief that he alone knew the path to victory, and that the normal rules and constraints of the Republic did not, and should not, apply to him. The sworn enemy, the relentless political antagonist who would shadow Scipio for the rest of his life, was Marcus Porcius Cato, later known as Cato the Elder. Cato was everything Scipio was not. While Scipio was a patrician from an ancient and glorious house, Cato was a new man from a plebeian family in the provincial town of Tusculum, the first of his line to achieve high office. While Scipio was a Philhellene, an admirer of Greek art, literature, and philosophy, Cato was a staunch traditionalist, a proud Roman farmer who viewed Greek influence as a decadent, corrupting force. He was the living embodiment of the mos maiorum, the ancestral way. He was austere, frugal, incorruptible, and possessed of a savage, biting wit and a relentless energy that he would direct, like a weapon against anyone he perceived as a threat to the old Roman virtues. In Scipio, Cato saw the ultimate threat. He did not see the savior of Rome. He saw a charismatic, quasi-monarchical figure whose individual prestige and popularity were dangerously unrepublican. He was suspicious of Scipio's intellectual circle, his luxurious lifestyle by Roman standards, and his seemingly divine self-confidence. To Cato, Scipio's long, flowing hair, his appreciation for Greek culture, and his popular appeal were signs of a man who wanted to be a king, not a magistrate of a free republic. Their conflict was not merely personal, it was ideological. It was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of Rome's future. Scipio represented a new Rome, cosmopolitan, expansionist, led by brilliant individuals who could adapt and innovate. Cato represented the old Rome, agrarian, isolationist, and governed by a collective aristocracy where no single man was allowed to shine too brightly. Cato's political genius lay in his ability to frame this ideological conflict in moral terms. He attacked Scipio not for his strategy, which was undeniably successful, but for his character, his perceived arrogance, and his supposed lack of traditional Roman gravitas. He became Scipio's prosecutor, a man who believed with every fiber of his being that in order to save the Republic from the cult of personality, the hero himself had to be brought down. His lifelong crusade against Scipio was born of a genuine, if fanatical, belief that he was saving Rome from a future of tyranny, a future he saw personified in the glamorous, brilliant, and dangerously popular figure of Africanus. Denied a consular army by the wary Senate, Scipio made his way to Sicily, the province allotted to him. Here, he was given command of the 5th and 6th legions, the survivors of Cannae, who had been condemned to serve in exile as punishment for their defeat. To any other commander, this would have been an insult. To Scipio, it was an opportunity. He understood the psychology of these disgraced soldiers better than anyone. They were men burning with a desire to redeem their honor, to wash away the stain of Cannae with victory. They were intensely loyal to the one commander who believed in them. This became the core of his new army. But it was not enough. He needed more men, more ships, more equipment, all of which the Senate had effectively denied him. So he bypassed the Senate altogether. He used his immense personal prestige and the vast wealth of the Cornelian family to appeal directly to the allied cities of Italy. From Etruria came timber to build a new fleet. From other cities came grain, weapons, and cloth. And from all over Italy, thousands of veterans and young men, inspired by his legend, flocked to Sicily to volunteer. He was raising a private army, funded by his own network, loyal to him personally. This was a profoundly un-Republican act, and it sent shockwaves of alarm through the senatorial old guard. While in Sicily, he subjected his forces to a relentless training regimen, drilling them in the complex cohort tactics and combined arms maneuvers he had perfected in Spain. He was not just preparing for an invasion. He was forging a professional military force, a prototype of the later Marian legions, whose allegiance was more to their general than to the state. This was the forge of the legend, the moment he transformed the Senate's attempt to sideline him into a demonstration of his unparalleled power and influence. He was showing them that he did not need their official sanction, that his auctoritas, his personal authority and prestige, was a source of power in itself, capable of raising fleets and armies. This very success, however, was what made him so terrifying to men like Cato. They saw a man operating outside the traditional structures of power, a man whose bond with his soldiers was personal and charismatic, and they understood that the weapon Scipio was forging in Sicily could one day be turned not just against Carthage, but against Rome itself. Woven into this grand tapestry of war and politics were the finer threads of Scipio's personal life and cultural leanings, the onions and vegetables that gave his story its unique flavor and contributed to the political backlash against him. Scipio was a leading figure in what became known as the Scipionic Circle, a group of aristocrats, philosophers, and poets who were passionate admirers of Hellenistic culture. in an era when many conservative Romans like Cato viewed Greek influence with deep suspicion, seeing it as effeminate and decadent. Scipio and his friends embraced it. They studied Greek philosophy, read Greek literature, and spoke the Greek language. This Philhellenism shaped Scipio's worldview, making him a more cosmopolitan and intellectually flexible leader than many of his peers. It informed his diplomacy, allowing him to connect with and win over Greek-speaking allies in Sicily and later in Africa. However, it also created a cultural gulf between him and the traditionalists in the Senate. They saw his refined tastes and intellectual pursuits not as a strength, but as a betrayal of the simple, agrarian Roman virtues. His personal life also played a role. He was married to Aemilia Paula, a woman from another powerful patrician family, who provided a stable and influential domestic anchor. Their family was a dynasty in the making, and the success of Scipio and his brother Lucius fueled fears among other aristocratic families that the Cornelii were becoming too dominant, upsetting the delicate balance of power within the Roman elite. These cultural and familial factors were not incidental. They were central to the case his enemies built against him. They painted a picture of a man who wasn't quite Roman, an elitist who preferred the company of Greek intellectuals to that of honest Roman senators, a man who was building a personal dynasty that threatened the collective nature of the Republic. The way he carried himself, the intellectual circle he cultivated, and the dynastic power he represented all became part of the narrative used to isolate him. His strengths, his intellect, his sophistication, his powerful family were reframed as dangers, providing his political opponents with the ammunition they needed to argue that the man saving Rome was simultaneously undermining the very essence of what it meant to be Roman. The first serious cracks in Scipio's seemingly unassailable reputation appeared during his time in Sicily, centered on the Greek city of Locri in southern Italy. After Scipio had captured the city from the Carthaginians, he left one of his legates, Quintus Plaminius, in command of the garrison. Plaminius proved to be a disastrous choice. He was a man of extreme brutality and avarice, who proceeded to plunder the city's temples, terrorize its citizens, and commit acts of horrific violence. When the people of Locri sent a desperate delegation to the Roman Senate to complain, it became a massive political scandal. This was the moment Scipio's enemies, led by Fabius Maximus and Cato, had been waiting for. They seized upon the Locri affair as the perfect weapon. They argued that Scipio, as the commanding officer, bore ultimate responsibility for the atrocities. They painted a picture of a commander so lax in his discipline, so absorbed in his own grand plans, that he allowed his subordinates to run rampant. They accused him of living a life of luxury in Syracuse, wearing Greek cloaks and sandals, and attending lectures at the gymnasium, while his men were committing unspeakable crimes. A commission of inquiry was sent by the Senate to Sicily, with secret instructions to arrest Scipio and strip him of command if any fault could be found. For a moment, his entire African expedition and his very career hung in the balance. When the commission arrived, however, they found not the dissolute commander his enemies had described, but an army and navy in a perfect state of readiness, impeccably trained and equipped for the invasion of Africa. They were so impressed by Scipio's preparations that they returned to Rome and gave a glowing report, exonerating him completely. Plaminius was arrested and punished, but the incident left a permanent stain. It was the first time his enemies had successfully mounted a coordinated political attack. They had failed to remove him, but they had succeeded in planting a seed of doubt. The affair was a harbinger of the storm to come, a demonstration of how his opponents would use any pretext, any scandal, to attack his character and undermine his authority. It proved that even as he prepared to face Rome's greatest external enemy, a far more insidious and persistent foe, was gathering strength within the city's own walls. The fateful act that would seal both Rome's victory and Scipio's tragic destiny was the invasion of Africa in 204 BC. After the Locri affair, there were no more obstacles. Scipio set sail from Sicily with an army of around 35,000 men and landed on the coast of North Africa, not far from Carthage itself. This was a moment of supreme, almost unthinkable audacity. He was taking the war to the enemy's homeland, a strategy Rome had not dared to attempt since the disastrous invasion of Marcus Attilius Regulus during the First Punic War. In a symbolic gesture of commitment, echoing the legends of Agathocles of Syracuse, it was said he burned his transport ships behind him, a fiery declaration to his men that there would be no retreat. Their only path home lay through the gates of Carthage. This act was psychologically brilliant. It electrified his own army, filling them with a sense of do-or-die resolve, while sending waves of panic through the Carthaginian populace, who had not seen a hostile army on their soil for half a century. Scipio's decision was driven by a clear-eyed strategic calculation. He knew that as long as Carthage itself was threatened, the Carthaginian Senate would have no choice but to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. He was deliberately triggering the final, decisive confrontation he had been preparing for his entire life. But psychologically, the decision stemmed from his unshakable self-confidence, his belief that he was a man of destiny. He was not just waging a war, he was orchestrating a historical drama with himself as the protagonist. This act, however, also represented the point of no return in his relationship with the Roman establishment. By invading Africa, he had staked everything on his own judgment, against the advice of the most senior figures in the Senate. If he succeeded, his prestige would become so immense that it would shatter the traditional balance of political power in Rome. If he failed, he would have doomed himself and one of Rome's last remaining armies. The landing in Africa was the ultimate gamble, the moment when Scipio's personal ambition, his strategic genius, and the fate of the Republic became irrevocably intertwined. The flames from his burning ships illuminated his path to glory, but also cast a long, dark shadow that would eventually follow him all the way back to Rome. The greatest catastrophe of Scipio's life was not a military defeat, but the political and personal consequence of his greatest military victory. The Battle of Zama, fought in 202 BC, was the apocalyptic climax the entire war had been building towards. On a vast, dusty plain in what is now Tunisia, the two greatest generals of the age finally met. Hannibal, recalled from Italy, commanded an army of veterans supplemented by a large but unreliable citizen levy and a terrifying screen of 80 war elephants. Scipio commanded his elite, battle-hardened army forged in Spain and Sicily, supported by the superb Numidian cavalry of his new ally, King Massinissa. The battle that followed was a contest of supreme tactical genius. Hannibal launched his elephants, hoping to smash and terrorize the Roman lines. But Scipio, anticipating this, had arranged his infantry in columns with wide lanes between them. The elephants were channeled harmlessly through the gaps and dispatched by skirmishers. Then, the infantry lines crashed together in a brutal, grinding struggle. For a time, the battle hung in the balance, but the decisive factor, just as Scipio had planned, was the cavalry. His Roman and Numidian horsemen, having driven the Carthaginian cavalry from the field, regrouped and slammed into the rear of Hannibal's infantry, just as Hannibal's cavalry had done to the Romans at Cannae. The Carthaginian army was encircled and annihilated. Zama was a total victory. Hannibal fled, Carthage was forced to sue for peace on humiliating terms, and the Second Punic War was over. Scipio returned to Rome not just as a triumphant general, but as a demigod. He was given an unprecedented triumph and the honorary cognomen Africanus. He was without question the first man in Rome, his popularity and auctoritas eclipsing that of any other figure. And this was the catastrophe. He had become too big. The Roman Republic was a system designed for a collective of aristocrats, and Scipio's singular glory threatened its very foundations. Senators who had once been his peers were now reduced to his subordinates in the eyes of the public. He had saved the state, but in doing so, he had proven that one man could be more important than the Senate and people of Rome combined. This was an intolerable truth for the traditional oligarchy. The very magnitude of his success sealed his fate. From the moment he rode his chariot through the streets of Rome, basking in the adulation of the masses, the knives were being sharpened. His victory at Zama ensured Rome's survival, but it also initiated his own long, slow political demise, as the system he had saved now turned its full attention to the problem of how to neutralize its savior. The collapse came not on the battlefield, but in the hostile arena of the Roman Forum, years after his triumph. It was a slow, methodical political assassination, a war of 1,000 cuts waged by his relentless enemies, with Cato as the chief prosecutor. The pretext was the war against the Seleucid king Antiochus the Great, which had been fought and won by Scipio's brother, Lucius, with Scipio Africanus serving as his legate in 190 BC. A year later, Cato and his political allies began to ask pointed questions. They demanded a public accounting of a sum of 500 talents of silver that had been paid by Antiochus, supposedly as war reparations. The implication was clear. The Scipio brothers had embezzled the money. It was a trumped-up charge, a technicality designed not to seek justice, but to inflict public humiliation. Lucius was brought to trial, and the political atmosphere was thick with venom. The attack was not really on Lucius, but on the towering prestige of his brother, Africanus. During the trial, in a moment of supreme drama and contempt, Scipio Africanus strode into the forum. As his brother was being asked to produce the account books to prove his innocence, Scipio took them, held them up for the crowd to see, and declared that it was beneath the dignity of the man who had brought 15,000 talents into the Roman treasury from the spoils of Carthage to account for a mere 500. Then, in a gesture of magnificent disdain for his accusers and the entire proceeding, he tore the account books to pieces before the assembled Senate. This act of defiance momentarily stunned his enemies, but it was a fatal political miscalculation. To his supporters, it was the act of a great man refusing to be pecked to death by lesser men. But to his enemies, and to many neutral senators, it was proof of his arrogance, confirmation that he believed he was above the law and the Constitution of the Republic. The legal attacks continued, growing more personal and more vicious. They were no longer just about money, but about his very character, his fitness to be a Roman citizen. The hero of Zama found himself dragged through the mud, forced to defend his honor against insinuations and legalistic traps. This was the collapse, the slow, grinding process of seeing his legacy tarnished, his name slandered, and his authority eroded by a political system that was determined to cut him down to size. The hero's finale was not a glorious death in battle, sword in hand, but a quiet, bitter act of renunciation. The relentless legal and political persecution finally broke his spirit. The final straw came when a tribune, at the instigation of Cato, attempted to formally prosecute him on charges of treason, dredging up the old accusations of corruption. On the day of the trial, Scipio appeared before the people in the forum. Huge crowds had gathered to witness the ultimate humiliation of their greatest hero. But instead of offering a legal defense, Scipio ascended the rostra and delivered a speech that was not a plea, but a rebuke. He reminded the assembled people that this very day was the anniversary of his victory at Zama. He declared that it was an impious day for legal squabbles and accusations. Instead, he said, they should all go with him to the Capitoline Hill to give thanks to the gods who had given them victory. He then turned his back on the court and the tribunes and began to walk towards the Capitol. The effect was electric. The crowd, swept up in a wave of memory and emotion, abandoned the trial and followed him, leaving the prosecutors standing alone and impotent in the forum. It was his last great victory, a moral triumph over his political enemies. But Scipio knew it was a temporary reprieve. He understood that as long as he remained in Rome, he would be a target, a source of political instability, a living monument whose very presence was an affront to his rivals. He had won the battle, but he had lost the war against the system. Shortly after this, he retired from public life, leaving Rome for his private villa at Liternum on the coast of Campania. It was a self-imposed exile, a final, contemptuous gesture. In walking away, he was saying that the city he had saved was no longer worthy of his presence. He refused to be judged by them, refused to participate in their poisonous political games. His last great act was not one of conquest, but of abdication. He simply left the stage, leaving a void that Rome would struggle to fill, and in doing so, he brought his own tragic story full circle. The man who had been given unprecedented power by the people now used that same popular authority to defy the state one last time before vanishing into a bitter, self-chosen obscurity. The legacy of Scipio Africanus is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a testament to the profound ambiguity of his role in Roman history. For centuries after his death, he was revered by many as the ultimate Roman hero, the embodiment of military genius and patriotic virtue. For Roman military writers and aspiring generals, he was the master strategist, the man who had defeated Hannibal, a figure of almost divine talent, whose campaigns were studied as a blueprint for victory. Figures like Cicero would later lionize him as part of a golden age of Republican heroes, a paragon of the aristocratic ideal who combined military prowess with cultural refinement. In this interpretation, his persecution and exile were seen as a national tragedy, a shameful act of envy and ingratitude by lesser men, a black mark on the honor of the Republic. This is the Scipio of legend, the noble savior, the Roman Alexander, betrayed by a petty and fearful Senate. However, a darker interpretation has always coexisted with this heroic narrative, an interpretation first championed by Cato and his allies, and echoed by later historians with a more critical eye. In this view, Scipio, for all his genius, was a profoundly disruptive and dangerous force. He was the prototype of the great warlord, the man whose personal charisma and bond with his soldiers dangerously weakened the authority of the state. His defiance of the Senate, his raising of a private army, his theatrical piety, and his final contemptuous act of tearing up the account books were all seen as precedents that eroded the foundations of Republican government. In this light, he is not the savior of the Republic, but the man who, by his very greatness, fatally wounded it. He created a model for personal power that would later be followed and perfected by figures like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and ultimately, Julius Caesar. According to this conflict of interpretations, Cato and the Senate were not acting out of petty jealousy, but out of a legitimate, if ruthless, desire to preserve the Republic from the threat of monarchy that Scipio, perhaps unwittingly, embodied. Thus, his legacy remains forever dual. Was he the Republic's greatest champion or the unwitting architect of its downfall? The answer likely lies in the uncomfortable truth that he was both. The final, comprehensive answer to the central paradox, why Rome's savior was driven into exile, is not found in any single man or event, but in the very DNA of the Roman Republic itself. The system was called a republic, but it was, in practice, a competitive oligarchy, a delicate ecosystem where power was jealously shared among a few hundred noble families. The entire political and social structure, the mos maiorum, was designed to prevent any one individual from becoming too powerful, from accumulating enough prestige or auctoritas to dominate the others. It was an immune system, and its primary function was to identify and attack any cell that grew too large, threatening to become a cancerous monarchy. Scipio Africanus, through his unprecedented military successes, became the ultimate threat to this system. He did not need to have monarchical ambitions. His very existence was a monarchical fact in a republican world. His triumph over Hannibal, the man who had terrorized Rome for a generation, elevated him to a status no Roman had ever achieved. The people adored him. His soldiers were fanatically loyal to him personally. His name alone carried more weight than a decree of the Senate. This was an intolerable reality for the Roman oligarchy. It broke the fundamental rule of their collective power. The campaign against him, led by Cato, was not simply a product of personal envy, although that was certainly a factor. It was the Republic's immune system kicking into overdrive. The charges of corruption, the public trials, the constant political harassment, these were the antibodies the system produced to attack and neutralize the oversized hero. Scipio's fatal flaw was not arrogance, although he was certainly arrogant. His fatal flaw was that he was too successful. He had saved the state so decisively that the state itself could no longer contain him. He was broken not by his enemies, but by the very political logic of the republic he had preserved. Rome had to destroy its greatest champion to save itself from what it feared most: the return of a king. The tragedy of Scipio is that he was a man perfectly suited to win Rome's wars, but temperamentally and existentially unsuited to the peacetime politics of the very city he had bled for. The universal lesson of Scipio's life transcends the specific politics of the Roman Republic and speaks to an eternal tension in human society: the fraught relationship between the exceptional individual and the collective. His story is a profound and tragic exploration of the price of genius. It demonstrates that the very qualities that make a person indispensable in a time of crisis, audacity, vision, supreme self-confidence, and a willingness to break the rules, are often the same qualities that make them intolerable in times of peace and stability. Scipio's life is a testament to the ingratitude of nations, the tendency of societies to forget, and even resent, the saviors who remind them of their past weakness and desperation. Once the existential threat is gone, the hero is no longer a shield, but a mirror, reflecting a time of fear that everyone wishes to forget. His presence becomes an uncomfortable reminder of the debt owed, a debt that is often easier to erase by destroying the creditor. Furthermore, his saga serves as a timeless warning about the inherent conflict between democratic or republican systems, which prize equality and the rule of law, and the disruptive force of transcendent individual talent. A system built for the predictable and the average often does not know how to accommodate the extraordinary. It can utilize genius in a moment of panic, but once the panic subsides, it will seek to grind the genius down, to reduce him to a manageable size, to force him back into the confines of the rules he was needed to shatter. The philosophical verdict of history on Scipio Africanus is that he was a man born for the storm, but drowned by the calm that followed. His life illustrates the brutal truth that sometimes the reward for saving civilization is to be exiled from it, lest your towering shadow prevent any new light from reaching the ground. The final frame, The image that lingers long after the story is told is not of the triumphant general in his chariot, showered with flowers and adoration. It is the image of a lonely, wind-swept tomb at Liternum, a place of bitter exile. It is the image of the inscription he is said to have wanted, a final, acidic message sent across the centuries. Ingrata patria, ne osa quidem mea habebis. Ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones. This is not the epitaph of a contented hero. It is the last will and testament of a man whose heart was broken by the very people he had saved. The empty tomb, for his final resting place, remains a mystery, as if he willed himself into oblivion rather than grant his bones to Rome, becomes a powerful metaphor. It is a monument to a void, a symbol of the gaping hole left in the fabric of the Republic by the expulsion of its greatest son. The shadow of that empty tomb would stretch all the way to the end of the Republic, a constant, unspoken question hanging over the generations of ambitious men who followed him. It asked whether it was possible to serve Rome to the fullest without being destroyed by it, and the answer it provided was a resounding, chilling no. The flame of Scipio's genius had burned so brightly it had saved Rome from the darkness, but it had also scorched the earth around him, leaving a barren patch where gratitude could not grow, only the bitter herbs of envy and fear.